well, that was a missed opportunity because we
Hmm.
felt like the whole purpose of that 5 years with them was to get out there the fact that these animals are being abused so that people would stop abusing them. And that was not what Tiger King was about.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day today. My name is Talal, and you are listening to the Popcorn and Soda Podcast, the show where we discuss all things movies, pop culture, and so much more. I want to thank each and every one of you for making me a small part of your day. On today's show, we're joined by a very special guest. She is the founder and CEO of Big Cat Rescue, the non for profit organization that aims to end the abuse of big cats in captivity, provide a safe home for big cats, and prevent extinction of big cats in the wild. She is also one of the stars of the Emmy nominated pop culture phenomenon Tiger King, which is celebrating its 1 year anniversary. On the show today, Carole Baskin. How are you, Carole?
Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Thank you for having me, Talal.
Thank you so much for coming to hang out on the show today. And yes, for everyone wondering, Carole and I did coordinate outfits and the backdrop. So none of this is coincidental, just throwing it out there. Carole, I am so fascinated by your story. And before we dive into Tiger King, the work you and the Big Cat Rescue Organization have done over the decades is so admirable. Where does this all begin for you? Your love of animals, love of big cats, and ultimately, what was the inspiration for starting Big Cat Rescue?
I always thought from the time that I was a child that I would help domestic cats and kittens who were being killed in shelters due to overpopulation. And from a very early age, I was going door to door selling Amway and uh, getting all the kids in the neighborhood to wash cars and wash trailers and trying to build a business because I felt like that was going to be a very expensive endeavor. And I ended up spending a lot of time in veterinary offices. And what happens whenever a bobcat, which are native here to the US, if they get hit by a car or shot by a hunter or poisoned, the vets can fix them up in 30 minutes to an hour, but then there's
Mm.
months of rehab before they can go back to the wild. And so I ended up, when I was 17, taking home bobcats from different vets' offices and getting them ready to go back to the wild. And there is nothing on this planet that is more vicious and more um, unthankful than a
Ah,
bobcat getting that
jeez.
kind of care. But I just love that about them. I love that they are so fierce and they're only like, 25 pounds, 30 pounds. They're not big cats, but man, they'll take on anything or anybody. And so I was 31, I think, when I was at an auction buying some llamas for a real estate business that we had. We would turn the llamas loose on big tracts of land and they clear about eye level. And then we'd
Oh,
move them
wow.
to the next piece. And so this guy came in with a 6-month-old bobcat and she was clutching to his neck. She was terrified. And if you can imagine an animal auction, there's all this noise and people running around and wild animals all being
Yeah.
scared, domestic animals being scared. And so the guy next to me starts bidding on this bobcat. And I leaned over to him and I said, when that cat grows up, she is going to tear your face off. And he said, I'm a taxidermist. I'm just going to club her in the head in the parking lot and make a den decoration out of her. And so
Jeez.
I started crying and my husband started bidding. And we probably paid more for that bobcat than anybody's ever paid for a bobcat in the history of bobcats. But she wasn't going to get clubbed in the head in the parking lot that day. And so she had been declawed. We couldn't release her back to the wild. Plus, she had been born in captivity, and it's not legal to release any captive born cat to the wild. So we ended up taking her home, and she was as wretched of a pet as you might imagine. She terrorized our German Shepherd. She chased my daughter around the house. She wouldn't let my husband into the bedroom. She'd lay up on top of the refrigerator, and if he'd open the door, she'd leap down on his head and start pulling his hair out. And instead of thinking, wow, this is a really, really bad pet, he
Jeez.
decided he wanted to find somebody that she could grow up with, that could tolerate her. And so he started calling around and he found a guy who said that he would sell us a kitten, but we had to drive there in person. So we loaded up the van with my daughter, who was 12 at the time, and a little friend of hers from school. And we drove up to Minnesota. And when we got there, there was this big metal shed, and we go inside, and the flies were so thick in there, we had to put handkerchiefs over our faces to be able to
Wow.
breathe. And there was just row after row after row of cages full of bobcats and lynx, Siberian lynx and Canada lynx. And I asked the guy if there was this big of a market for them as pets, because every bobcat I had ever met was
Mhm.
just evil.
Yeah.
He said, no, he said, whatever we don't sell as pets, we'll slaughter next year for their fur. And about that time, I was looking around the room because it was dark in there. My eyes were starting to adjust. And there were a pile of dead bobcats and lynx in the corner. And they had just cut
Jeez.
off this piece of belly fur. And he was explaining that that's the only part they use for the coats. That's the white fur with the spots that you see on trim on coats and things.
Yeah.
And so he said they feed the rest of the carcass back to the animals, back to the other cats and mink and other kinds of animals living there. And I burst into tears, and I heard my husband through all of that saying how much for every cat here. And we came home with 56 bobcats, Canada lynx, and Siberian lynx. And that led us to the rescue of 28 the next year, and then 22 the next year. And by that time, we had gotten all of the lynx and bobcats off of fur farms in the United States. And we were starting to work on getting them out of the Canadian fur farms when I lost my husband in 97. But during that period of time, when people found out what we were doing, they started calling. And keep in mind, this is before the internet.
Yeah.
So, word traveled a lot slower back then. But when they found out we were doing all these bobcat rescues, they'd start saying, hey, would you take my lion? Would you take my tiger? And I'm like, what? What are people doing with lions and tigers in America in their backyards? And it was such an eye-opening thing to me. And every time along the way, I thought, I can fix this. How hard could it be to fix this? And
Right.
it's turned out to be nearly a 30-year slog to fix this. But I think we're closing in on it now with a federal bill that will ban the private possession of big cats and stop the cub petting, which is what drives most of the breeding and discarding, is people paying to have the pictures made with a cub.
Gotcha. So, what did 2020 look like for Big Cat Rescue with a pandemic that completely changed everything? What were some of the biggest challenges that the team encountered?
In March 15th of 2020, we decided we needed to stop our tours. Our tours were about a third of our revenue. We have to raise between $3.5 and $4 million a year. And our tours they're not like what you saw in Tiger King. One day a year, we did what you saw in Tiger King, which is like 600 people come here for 3 hours and
Right,
then
right.
go home. But the way our tours worked were 20 people would be very close together with a tour guide and with what we call a backup, somebody that makes everybody stay really close together so they don't bother the cats or wander off or get hurt. And for an hour and a half, we would educate people about why these make bad pets, why you should never pay to see them in zoos, and why you should never, handle them, and all of those kinds of things. And then at the end, we would take them into our gift shop and actually help them make a call to Congress to support our federal bill.
Wow.
But you can't have 20 people close together like that in COVID when it first
Oh,
hit,
no.
because we didn't know how this thing was being transmitted. We were all wearing masks, and we were being
Hmm.
told that you couldn't touch any surfaces. And so it was like, well, I can't have somebody come into the gift shop and use the restroom. I'd have to have somebody going in and cleaning behind every single person that went into the restroom. So all of this was just like, oh my gosh, we're just going to close the doors. And we didn't know how that was going to turn out because it was a third of our income. And so within a few weeks, as COVID started really showing how devastating it was all around the world, I had to let go half of my staff. We had about 22 paid staff at the time. And all of our animal care has always been done by volunteers. But we did a lot of things that we had paid staff to do, things people won't do as a volunteer because it's boring, like writing the thank you letters to the donors, or going out and talking at Rotary clubs, which not a lot of that was happening. Going out and talking at the schools about conservation. Our PR person, all of those people I had to let go. And that meant that the half of us who were left behind, and even my husband and I didn't take a paycheck for 8 months, but those of us that were left behind were working double and triple shifts on the kind of work that we had been doing, trying to keep everything going and keep it all afloat. And then 5 days after COVID hit was when Tiger King hit. And then I had people who believed the false narrative that they had seen on Tiger King. And they were setting up Facebook protests to storm the gates of Big Cat Rescue and threatening to burn the place to the ground. And my phone was ringing every 2 minutes for about 3 months straight with people threatening to kill me and kill my family and kill the cats. And I'd ask them, why the cats? Why do you want to kill the cats? And they said, because they don't belong in cages. And I said, did you not get that about who we are? We are absolutely against the practice of breeding cats for life in cages. But that's not what people came away with. They came away believing the animal abusers who were saying that I wanted to have all the cats. And it's like, no, that was never our goal. Our goal has always been to put ourselves out of business, because you shouldn't have to have a place that rescues cats from horrible places. You just shouldn't have horrible places. And that's what our federal bill will finally put an end to.
Carole, what would you say is the biggest misconception about big cats?
I think the biggest misconception, oh gosh, there's several, but one of the biggest misconceptions is that you should breed big cats because they're endangered. And to the simple mind, that makes sense. If you don't have enough, breed more. But none of the cats that are being bred in captivity can ever go free. And just having cats in cages isn't conservation. The whole idea of conservation is a healthy planet where we all have a life support system that we can depend on, that has fresh air and clean water. And it's the big cats that are the umbrella species in those ecosystems that keep the entire ecosystem intact. So if the cats don't exist in the wild doesn't exist. And then we don't have fresh air or clean water. And so we have to protect them where they live, not in cages. And so that's been one of the toughest things for people to wrap their heads around. And the other misconception about them is that somehow they can be your friend, that you can raise them. And it's because the breeders tell you this. They say that you can raise them in your family and they'll be just like a dog, and that it's going to love you like it loves its mother. In the wild, when the cat grows up to be big enough to kill its mother, it will kill its mother for the territory. So they're exactly the same thing in your house. Once you raise them to be adults, they will kill you. That's just the way it is.
Yeah. And that's so true. It's such a conception that we think that if we domesticate a big cat, it's going to be like a dog or a cat, where this is the only environment that it knows. But I guess the animal nature of big cats, it doesn't really allow for that.
They grow up to be who they were meant to be.
Interesting. Now that we are slowly easing out of a lockdown and hopefully things get better as the months come along, what's next for Big Cat Rescue? Do you think that we'll potentially be going back to those tours, or is it going to be a case by case thing? In your opinion, what's the future for Big Cat Rescue?
I really don't know. All of our people here are vaccinated. Our state doesn't allow us to require that somebody prove if they're visiting that they're vaccinated. So it would be strictly based upon them having compassion enough for the cats that they wouldn't bring that to us. And the problem is right now that there is no vaccine for exotic cats, and they can catch COVID-19 and die from it. So even though we're protected, we can't protect the cats, which means our keepers are still having to wear masks whenever we're close to the cats or when we're preparing their food. And I just yesterday heard that Zoo Tampa was talking about a vaccine for big cats, but I haven't heard anybody else talk about it. So I don't know if the reporter was misunderstanding what they were talking about, or if there really is something in the works, but I want to look into that. And I just sent that to both of our vets yesterday saying, what is this? Because we need this, whatever it is. We have started doing some private tours for our larger donors where it's 5 people or less, and they can't come into the gift shop at all. We've completely closed all of that down. So they come into the parking lot, they get onto a golf cart, we drive them through the sanctuary and then back out the front gate. So they're not coming anywhere close to the cats or breathing on any of our people here, that even though our people are vaccinated, you can still contract it. So it's not, you won't die from it, is my understanding, but you could still get very sick. And if you're sick, you're going to pass it to the cats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just one of those things. We'll see how the world progresses in the next year or so. And maybe there won't even be a normal to go back to, maybe a new normal that we're all going to adapt to. And I think that's one of the benefits of if you can take out anything from this pandemic is that we've all learned new skills, learned more about each other and ourselves, and it's only beneficial for us to apply that to our everyday lives moving forward rather than going back to what things were before.
I absolutely agree with that. And what I've been really pressing for years is for people to experience big cats where they live through remote controlled cameras. And so we have about a dozen remote controlled cameras on the property
Wow.
currently, and we're installing, I think, something like 36 more. But I just recently, just a couple days ago, talked to Iconic Engine, who said that they actually created a 360 camera that can be internet streaming. And so they're extremely expensive right now, but most tech is in its early phases. And so as long as we can create a demand for seeing cats through these cameras instead of in person, then imagine putting those out in the wild where these cats live and seeing what they really do all
Yeah.
day. That's educational. That is where zoos need to be remaking themselves, is into these big location based experiences where people can see cats from all around the world. And then I just got to talking to some people about using crypto as a way of powering that. So if you can imagine selling a crypto coin where the possessor of the coin has like a subscription fee, that is their subscription fee when they buy that coin to a certain camera. So you might buy a camera, you might buy access to a camera that is here at the sanctuary in one of the tiger enclosures. But you could also buy access to a camera in India where the tigers are living free. And then the other side of that coin is that where that money goes to is to wherever that camera is. So that if it's going to the wild, then the people who are living next to tigers there are in charge of protecting those cameras and making sure that there is plenty of cats in those areas that have access to plenty of prey and that there's plenty of forest. And
Mhm.
instead of burning the forest down so that you have a little bit of heat in your hut, you're making so much money off of these cameras
Yeah.
that you can afford better ways of taking care of your family than just plundering the environment around you. So I think this is a global thing where we could all participate in this kind of exchange where we all get to see wildlife doing what they do and fund the care for those animals wherever they are. And then if you think about zoos, they would be like, they would have coins for hundreds, thousands of these different cameras.
Oh yeah.
So an individual may not be able to afford all of that, but you could pay your $10 and go to the zoo, put on their headset and experience any place in the world because they're paying for those feeds. And zoos have said for years that their purpose is for conservation. This would actually make that true.
Yeah, the innovation of technology is just going to bring the world so much closer together and get us to really experience these big cats in their natural habitat. Now, Carol, what would you say that you're the most proud of personally for the impact that big cat rescues had worldwide over the last close to 30 years?
I think the federal bill that we're working on right now will be the biggest thing that we've done. And it's not just me. I mean, we're a whole team of people. My husband works on this as hard or harder than I do. All of our staff and volunteers are constantly getting people to call their member of Congress. But what this bill does is it stops the cub petting and it phases out private ownership. Once you do that, you have completely turned off the taps for all of these tiger cubs and lion cubs that are ending up being discarded as soon as they get to be 12 weeks old. That's when they quit being a profitable
Mhm.
prop and become a liability. And then they're spending 20 years in a prison cell for crimes they didn't commit. So stopping that flow will be the best thing that I think we can do.
That's amazing. And transitioning from Big Cat Rescue to quite possibly one of the most watched documentaries of all time and this pop culture juggernaut, which is Tiger King. It was almost a perfect storm where not only the subject matter that the team at Netflix tried to portray was just so outrageous and wild, but the timing of the release also played a huge factor on the success of the show. We all know the story, we know the characters. With the show celebrating its 1 year anniversary, I want to dive into things from your perspective. What was the original concept of the show that was presented to you?
We worked with the producers for 5 years, and we were working with several other producers during that period of time. up until then, we had never been betrayed by a producer. We always open our gates for free to anybody who was doing anything to talk about the plight of tigers
Yeah.
in the world and how we should save them. And so they said that their product was being called stolen wildlife. And their plan was for it to be like the Blackfish for big cats. Did you see
Okay.
Blackfish?
Yeah. It's a great documentary.
So it changed the way people thought about seeing orcas in concrete swimming pools. And once people knew how cruel that was, they wouldn't support it. And SeaWorld had to change their model. They couldn't take animals from the wild anymore. They couldn't do the abusive shows anymore because the public knew what was going on. And so we were being told by the producers of what turned out to be Tiger King that they wanted to show all of this abuse and how these cubs were ending up in horrible situations, and they wanted to know everything about it. And so for 5 years, we educated them about all of these horrible things, told them who all of the bad actors were. And you met a lot of them in Tiger King.
That's
But
definitely a fact. Yeah.
they apparently weren't able to sell it to CNN, which was the main one, was the one that had bought Blackfish. And I don't know what happened at that point, but my guess is that when they found that nobody wanted to buy a documentary, they decided to turn it into something that would be entertaining instead. And that's why they went to Netflix. It's just a guess on my part. But for them to completely flip the narrative on its head and make all of these animal abusers look like quirky, fun, interesting
Yeah. Like
characters.
rock stars almost. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the one person who was trying to stop them from abusing big cats painted to be a gold digging, home wrecking murderer. That was fascinating that you could even do something like that. And even more fascinating that people believed it without a shred of evidence. And so much evidence to the contrary that we had given them and that we put out after the fact, but people didn't care. They were entertained and they didn't have a reason to care.
Yeah, it's one of those things where just the way content is consumed and the way content is created now, where you can shoot something just like the way the two of us are right now and completely just change the entire narrative during post-production. It's got its pros and cons, but in this situation, it definitely painted many people as these great people that are trying to preserve animals and these rock stars. And it painted a different picture for a lot of people like yourself who seem to be wanting to progress the sanctuary of these animals and trying to get them back in the wild and preventing them from being in captivity. What was your initial reaction to watching it? Were you able to get through the whole thing, or was it just like, I'm not going to even bother with this?
Well, when the trailer came out for it, when they were starting to advertise that it was coming, my husband and I were like, who's doing that show? And so we reached out to the producers because usually everybody in this industry knows what everybody else is working on.
Yeah.
And they're usually filming for a couple of years until it happens. And the producers of Tiger King had told us that, again, it was going to be called Stolen Wildlife. And they said that Joe Schreibvogel would be in it, but he'd just be, one minor character compared to all of these other people that were abusing big cats. So when this thing coming out was called Tiger King, and it seemed to be all about some feud between Joe Exotic and me, and it's like, I've never even spoken to Joe. How could who is working on this show? And what on earth are they doing? And all of a sudden, the producers didn't want to talk to us anymore. And so we were like, all right, well, we need to see what this is all about. And we sat there and binge watched it just like everybody else did. And at the end of it, we just sat there gobsmacked looking at each other and said, well, that was a missed opportunity because we
Mhm.
felt like the whole purpose of that 5 years with them was to get out there the fact that these animals are being abused so that people would stop abusing them. And that was not what Tiger King was about. It was like the tigers were this much of the storyline, which was
Yeah.
really such a missed opportunity. And we had no idea that the public would react to it the way they did until my phone started ringing, which was about 5 minutes later. And that was when all of the abuse started. And I mean, people were so angry and so fired up. And I sat through it 7 times because I was like,
Wow.
how why would anybody believe a bunch of animal abusers saying that I killed my husband? What on earth would make people think that these were legitimate voices? And after watching it 7 times, I was like, you know what? They really did a good job of convincing the public. And so I did a page at bigcatrescue.org/Netflix where I went minute by minute by minute through the entire 7 episodes and said, when you were seeing this on the screen, this is what was going on behind the scenes, or this is the receipts or the documentation that showed that this is all a lie. And I thought, once I did that, people would find it, they would read it, they would understand that this whole thing had just been a total sham. And people didn't. Instead, they just continued to create memes and
Yeah. Change the
stupid comments
narrative.
on
Yeah, it's
TikTok.
yeah.
And it was awful. And it didn't subside for about 3 months, and then it started. My husband says it's like a wave, it came in really
Yes.
fast, hot and heavy, but then it goes out kind of slowly, and so that slow, retreat out has finally taken place.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's just as I mentioned, it was just a perfect storm at the perfect time where people started getting into quarantine and lockdown, and there's not much else you can really do except watch television, movies, stuff around the house. And this is something that just everyone in the world is talking about. Now, you'd mentioned how you kind of broke down minute by minute on the site as to what really happened. So, how much of it would you say, percentage wise, is actually accurate if you had to put a number to it?
I think about the only thing that they got right is that there are tigers in horrible situations across America, and just about everything else is wrong. Um, I mean, I only address the things that affected me. I can't say how much of what they said about Doc Antle may have been wrong or about Tim Stark. I think those are all some pretty horrible people, and that um, they probably called them outright, but I don't know that they'd have to answer that themselves. But I do know, and I know from dealing with them, like we would be filming something and they'd ask me a question and I'd answer them and they'd ask me the question a different way and then a different way. And then it's like 10 times into this, it's like, what are you trying to get me to say? And it was so that they could Frankenbite these pieces
Right.
together. And a lot of times you'll notice as you're going through, if you're really paying attention, like it's different days, I have on different jewelry, I have on different clothes, and
Yeah.
yet they're trying to piece it all together as a consistent narrative. I think one of the worst things that they did, as far as that Frankenbiting goes, was they had asked me, "Is there anything that you would say to Joe Exotic or Doc Antle about the horrible things that they have done?" And my answer was that there's nothing that I would say to them because there's nothing that's going to change the way they are or the way they make money. And what they did in the film was they said, "Is there anything that you would say to Don's daughters?" And then had me say that piece where I was talking
Yeah.
about animal abusers, not his daughters, and made it look like I was being hateful to them. So even though there were times where they said things that I thought were pretty hateful to me in the film, God only knows how many times they were badgered into saying something so that they could grab those little
Yeah.
bits that they needed in order to create that narrative.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it just goes back to having all this different footage of especially yourself over the 5 years and then kind of copying and pasting it as to where it's convenient for the narrative of the story that they're trying to tell. Now, the story really centers around yourself and this so-called feud between Joe Exotic. And it's really interesting how you mentioned just you've never actually even met the guy. And you happen to live like rent free in his head and in his life. And it's really fascinating how almost this obsession that he has with you uh, over your views on big cats and whatnot. What are your thoughts about Joe Exotic? Do you think that what we saw on film is just a character for self promotion, or have you ever actually had any sort of communication, just not even face to face, like over the phone with this gentleman?
I've never spoken to Joe, and I've only ever seen him 5 times. 4 times were in court. 2 times because we were suing him because he was using our name, and he
Yeah.
was using our name to do his cup heading. So people were seeing that and thinking it was us, and so he was ruining our reputation, and we had to stop him. And we got a $1 million judgment against him. But throughout that entire lawsuit, I only saw him in court twice. My husband was always the person who dealt with our attorneys and who dealt with
Right.
the deposition of Joe and talking to Joe. I never had anything to do with that. But if they had pitted this as being my husband, who's a Harvard MBA and like Mr. Rogers, like the nicest man in the world, if they tried to pit him against Joe Exotic, that wouldn't have been a very good story because Joe couldn't say anything negative about anything Howie's ever had anything to do with. So the only other time that I saw Joe was we were in Ohio, and I don't know if you're aware of that guy that had released 56 lions and tigers and bears in Ohio in 2011.
Okay.
And then he committed suicide. And
No.
so Ohio was having a hearing about banning the private ownership of lions, tigers, and bears after that. And so I went to talk in favor of the law. And of course, Joe went to talk in favor of not having such a law because he depended on being able to sell animals to these people all across the country. And he attacked a woman who was the head of the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. And so I jumped in between the two of them to keep him from scaring the bejesus out of her. But even then, I never said anything to him. He just saw that when I wasn't going to let him pick on her, he ran off. And that's been the extent of my interactions with Joe Schreibvogel. But once we were in court with him, we got to know his family, and we know his brothers and sisters. We knew his parents. And what is really downplayed in Tiger King is the fact that when Joe was on trial for the murder for hire and for killing the tigers and selling tigers across state lines, after the laws changed in 2016, that was illegal. And so he needed a character witness, and not even his own mother would come and be a character witness for him at the trial. Not one person in his entire family came to speak up for him. Only one person came to even watch the trial, and that was his niece, Chelsea, who was in Shooting Joe Exotic, a film that was done by the BBC this year, where she talks about how, and she says the same thing all of Joe's family had told us over the years, which was you can't believe a word that comes out of his mouth because he's fixated on being the center of attention and having people feel sympathy for him and feeling like he's the underdog, and that he's always been that way in their family, and that's the way he's been with his business. So, as far as how characters were misrepresented, I think that was one that if they had talked to the family or they probably did talk to the family, but it just didn't fit their narrative. They would have been able to show the public that this was a really bad person who, not one person, I mean, even his husband was the one who came in and testified against him. There wasn't one person willing to speak up for this man.
Yeah, and it's really evident in the documentary itself. A lot of the things that Joe did to either the staff or the animals, or even to himself in many ways, there's a lot of self-destructive ways in that. And as just a consumer, I think a lot of us are sometimes drawn to train wrecks and to car crashes in many ways. And we see this guy who's a cartoon character in so many ways. A lot of people want to actually make him out to be a hero or some sort of savior of these animals. And they paint him as a picture of the everyday guy who's trying to fight the big bad Carole Baskin and the big cat rescue. It's really interesting and wild how human nature just perceives media that is just shown to us in a different light than from your experience that you had. Have you personally, and I don't even know if it's something that like is even possible, do you think there's redemption for a guy like Joe, or even specifically anyone who's in this trade right now who might actually watch Tiger King and realize that, hey, you know what? There is a lot of bad that we're doing in this industry with the domestication of these animals and having these private zoos. Do you think that people like Joe and just a lot of the other people that were in that documentary, can they redeem themselves? Is there a way to actually make things right?
I think there is, because I think probably most people who find themselves in possession of wild animals have gone through some kind of a change from the very beginning. So I know that there is a place out in California, it's called Paws, and the lady who started, it's a sanctuary for elephants and tigers. And the lady who started that used to be a trainer for Hollywood. And then she saw how horrible and abusive that industry was. And she changed her ways and she created this sanctuary. And now it's one of the best sanctuaries in the world. And, in my early days, the only people I could go to for advice were the people who were breeding and dealing big cats because the zoos wouldn't talk to me. I was the stupid pet trade that I didn't even know existed when I rescued all those bobcats. And I said, what should I feed these guys and how much space do they need? And I got hung up on. And so I reached out to people that were breeding the cats, and they were telling me that I should be breeding these cats for future generations because they were going extinct. And I believed it until the internet came along and I found out they were lying and that none of these cats were ever going to go free and none of them were purebred. So they didn't serve any conservation value. And I never bred lions or tigers, but I bred some of the smaller, more rare cats in the early years from like 93 to 97. But as far as people like Joe changing, I don't know if that's possible because what Tiger King tried to put across, and even some other shows have tried to put across before and after that, as far as he was concerned, was to say that he was this animal lover and he set up this sanctuary and he was trying to do the right thing. And then he got caught up in the money and the fame and the glory, and then he lost his way. His family say he was always abusive to animals. He would shoot birds and then try to revive them so that he could show people how he had saved the birds. And he would shoot all of these little like marmot looking animals and just lined them up because he loved killing animals. And I don't think you ever go from being that kind of a person to being somebody who then does good, who then turns bad again. I think that whole thing about anybody ever thinking that it was for a good reason was probably just because of the attention that he got from doing it. So, back in the 90s when the internet came along, that was when all of us who had any intention of learning any better or doing any better had the opportunity to do so. And we either did or they didn't. And the ones who didn't were the ones you saw in Tiger King, who are still abusing animals because that's an easy way to make money for them, I think.
Yeah. So it's one of those things. We'll see what the future of this industry really goes, especially with something as influential as Tiger King. Maybe there could be some benefits that come out of this for a lot of people, or even someone watching at home that gets inspired by some of the stories in there to actually want to help these big cats. So let's dive into some of the positives that potentially can come out of a project like this. You touched up on it a little at the start. Let's get that out of the way. Some of the memes that were made out of this. And again, it falls into that perfect storm where TikTok was just becoming a thing at the start of the pandemic and with Tiger King coming out. Was there any meme that actually made you laugh, or like was there anything that kind of made you chuckle? Because not all of most of them are pretty like malicious, let's be honest, but a lot of them were either making just good light of your cool cats and kittens, or Joe saying I'll never financially recover from this. Is that anything make you laugh, or was all of that just not really your thing?
I gathered all of those memes, and whenever people would post them, they would tag me in them, so they showed up in my feed. And so I created a whole folder full of all of those memes. And I would say out of the, I don't even know how many thousands of them there are, but yeah, there was probably 2 or 3 times where I thought, oh, if that was clever or that was funny, but that was really rare that somebody said something that I thought was really funny or clever. But there are some really good things that came out of Tiger King. And there was only one scene in there where that mother tiger was giving birth and all the guys at GW Zoo were gathered around and they were using that metal hook to hook the baby and drag it to the side and then squeeze it through the wire. People saw that and they were outraged. And I think that was probably the best thing in the entire 7 episodes, because the people who really got how cruel that was and how the people who were making money off of those cubs were treating those cubs, I think that was the death knell in that whole pay to play industry. And, of course, people couldn't go out and do that kind of thing for a while. So that helped a lot. And then, of course, seizing all of the animals from Tim Stark and from Joe Exotic's GW Zoo and Jeff Lowe and Nick Skulak and all of these huge tiger mills that went down during that period of time, that has helped to reduce the availability of cubs for people to go out and pay to pet. So that was really beneficial. And I also think that as horrible as I was portrayed in it, it gave people enough curiosity to want to talk to me that I was able to talk about the issues. So, Dancing with the Stars would not have happened if not for Tiger King. I'm sure nobody from Dancing with the Stars was ever going to call me and ask me to dance. And the same thing with the um, when they dropped the ball on Midnight with Anderson Cooper and
Yeah, the New York
those
thing.
guys were
Yeah.
never going to call me if it hadn't been for Tiger King. But having some of those really high profile things happen so that I could talk about the issues, got the issues out there in front of more people so that they could understand them more. And so we're seeing more advancement of our federal bill than we've ever seen before, more people talking about the issues. I heard in the New York Post or New York Times this morning, there was a article called something like why zoos need to not exist any longer or something like that. And it was like,
Right.
finally,
Okay.
mainstream America is getting this. These animals don't belong in cages.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in hindsight, and of course, everything in hindsight's 2020. If you could go back and you can either choose to take part in this, knowing how it turned out, or not take part of this, knowing that, this is going to turn out the way it did. The pros and cons of what came out of it versus what didn't. Would you do it all over again if you had the choice?
I would, because I'm seeing these benefits for the cats and for our planet. My family would not. And I
Yeah.
think the reason makes a lot of sense. If you call me names and if you accuse me of things that I didn't do, you can't make me feel bad because I didn't do those things. And so even if you really believe them, it doesn't matter what you believe. It's not going to change who I am
Yeah,
or how I feel
it's true.
about myself. But if somebody were saying those things about your mother or your significant other, then there's that, I don't know
Yeah,
what it is,
that
but something
protectiveness
inside of
that
you where,
comes out.
yeah, and so it just eats at them that people would say such things or believe such things when they know that those things aren't true. And so I think it's been much harder for them than it has been for me.
Mhm. Now, when you have a story this massive and this commercial, of course, Hollywood's gonna come knocking, and there are multiple Tiger King based projects in the works. NBC's producing a show with Saturday Night Live's Kate McKinnon playing herself. What are your thoughts on that? And are you a part of that in any way?
I'm not a part of it. They had actually reached out to me at the very beginning. They are patterning. There was a podcast that came out by Wondery called something like Joe Exotic. Um, and it was in August before Tiger King came out. And I had spoken to the reporter who did this podcast, and he did a great
Right.
job of it. And he did the same thing that they did in Tiger King, with one huge exception. So when he was doing his podcast, he led you through this whole thing, made you think all of these animal abusers were doing the right thing, that they were saving animals, that they loved animals, and that I was this person that was just, constantly giving them trouble. And then at the end, he said, but here's what I found out to be true. None of these animals are going back to the wild. None of this breeding is helping. Actually, all these people are doing is making money and supporting themselves. And here's this one woman who's trying to stop all this abuse. And so I thought when I watched Tiger King the first time through, okay, they're just following that same thread.
Right.
They're leading the
Mhm.
person down a track. And then at the end, they're going to say, but here's what we found out to be true. They never got there. And I found that fascinating. And then, they did that like later episode where it wasn't like a
Yeah, the
real
King and
episode.
I, the Tiger King and I, or something like that, where it's like a retrospect on the entire series. Yeah, yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe that's going to be it. Maybe in that's where they're going to tell the truth. No, that was just, it was awful, whatever it was, but it was not about telling the truth. So they just never got back to what the Wondery podcast had been. The Kate McKinnon piece is based on the Wondery podcast, not based on Tiger King. So my hope is that they will do the same thing and they'll lead the people down that path. And then at the end, tell them, but here's what we found out to be true. And, be a much more impactful film than Tiger King was because of the fact that it will talk about the exploitation of these animals and how we need to stop it. So that's what I'm hoping for. But right after the Wondery podcast came out, they reached out to us and said, hey, we'd like to do like a series of this. And what do you guys think about working with us on it? And at that time, we were like, I don't know. And then Tiger King
Yeah.
came out. We were just like, I'm not dealing with anybody right now. I just don't trust anybody after that.
Yeah.
So they have not reached out since Tiger King. And I really hope that they do follow the Wondery podcast model and that they do some research before they go out there and just tell the same lies all over again.
Yeah. So I gotta ask you this: Nicolas Cage as Joe Exotic. It's like a match made in heaven, where you have this cartoon character and Joe Exotic, and then you have this Nicolas Cage with his Nicolas Cageisms. Thoughts on that?
I love Nicolas Cage. I
Yeah.
absolutely loved him in City of Angels and in Moonstruck. I just thought he was the most fascinating movie star. And to think of him playing Joe Exotic, it's just, I know he will do it probably better than anybody's ever done it. But then I don't know if I could ever look at Nicolas Cage the same again
Oh,
and
I
not
know,
see
eh?
this tiger murdering hitman hiring person.
Oh, geez. I guess that's just going to be another project that we're just going to have to wait to see how it actually shapes and what the narrative and the story they try to tell through that. So that's going to be interesting. There's a lot of great things in the works. So let's talk about yourself. What are some of your upcoming projects on the horizon? We saw you on Dancing with the Stars. What's next for Carole Baskin?
We're working on a pilot for what we hope will be a series, but I can't talk about what we're doing in that yet, other than to
Okay.
say that there is some really big and amazing stuff coming.
All right. We'll take that for what it is. Some amazing stuff coming from Carole Baskin. As we wrap up, it is now time for a segment I call the final act. Carole, I'm going to ask you 10 rapid fire questions about your likes, your dislikes. We just want the first thing that pops into your mind. You up for the challenge?
Sure.
Movies or TV shows?
Movies.
Theater or watch at home?
Home.
Favorite movie?
Memento.
Uh, Favorite TV
I
show?
love that film.
Oh, that's a great movie. Oh, Christopher Nolan, he's the man, honestly. Favorite TV show?
Ooh, I don't really watch TV. Like the last time first thing came in my mind, The Waltons.
Okay. All right.
It's been a
We got the
while.
Waltons. All right. We got some tiger-based questions here. What's a tiger's favorite food?
It depends on the tiger.
All right. We got that. What should you do in a situation if you come across a wild big cat?
It depends on the situation, but if the cat is coming at you, then make yourself as big as you possibly can and come toward the cat, and the cat will think you have completely lost your mind and will probably run.
All right. Some wise words from Carole Baskin there. Favorite movie based on cats?
Movie based on cats. I think it would be Life of Pi. And the reason
Yeah.
is because that was really, I mean, I hate that they use that one live tiger in there, but I love the fact that all of Hollywood is going CGI.
Yeah, for sure. What was the last time you watched Tiger King?
Probably May or June of last year.
Okay. Have you had a chance to watch Army of the Dead, Zack Snyder's? Fun fact, the crew came to your sanctuary to kind of understand how these tigers and big cats move. Had you had a chance to watch that movie?
I am scared to death of horror films. I can't make it through 5 minutes of a horror film. As soon as somebody starts walking slow, I'm like, oh my God, I can't watch.
Okay.
Um, but I was really thrilled that they used our cats for that. And that's typical of how things have worked here. A film crew will come, they'll be here for days on end, and then we never know what they're coming up with until we see it out there in the wild.
All right. And lastly, describe Big Cat Rescue in one word.
Peaceful.
Bam. That was awesome, Carole. We love all your amazing insight and your amazing answers. For everyone listening that would like to find out more about Big Cat Rescue or find a way to get involved with the good work that the team is doing, please visit bigcatrescue.org. Carole, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today. Your work for this organization has been remarkable. I wish you all the best in all your upcoming projects, and I look forward to having you back on the show to discuss the next one.
Thank you so much. And thank you for dressing the part today.